Okay, well, welcome everybody. We're going to do something a little bit different at today's Disruption Conference. We did it at this spring's Hotter Than Hell conference, but we're going to do a live broadcast of what we call Close of Business Tuesday. Close of Business Tuesday is something that our firm started about 2 years ago. And every Tuesday we just try to talk about some issue, some topic, some policy, some technology, something that's really has the potential to change energy, like what we've seen so much of here today. When we were thinking about wild cards and things that could really shake things up, there's obviously been a ton of discussion about nuclear. And some of it's modular, some of it's fusion, but in general, there's a recognition that there is a source of power which is reliable and which is carbon-free, and for some reason we have stopped talking about it. So we reached out to the Nuclear Energy Institute and talked with them about appearing with us today and talking about nuclear. So let me introduce Matt Croz and Everett Redmond. They're two senior guys with the NEI, very versed in these issues, and have a long history in the technology around and all the other issues around nuclear. So why don't I just go ahead and ask for a round of applause welcoming these guys virtually. It's really going to be fun. So Everett and Matt, why don't you guys just hold on a second. We'll do something that we always do, which is at the beginning of these things, we just like to do a quick rundown of what's happening in the marketplace and what's on everyone's mind, rolling into today. With me, we've got Mike Bradley. He's our energy equity strategist. Colin Fenton, he's our chairman of TPH Commodities. Matt Portillo's head of research. And you, of course, know Craig Webster. He's a jack of all trades from ESG to everything ESG touches, which at this point includes every single part of the world. But that's our crew. Mike, let me start with you. We haven't been watching our screens today. What's going on in the marketplace?
Yeah, today was all about crude oil. As we have been talking about for a couple days, the short-term energy outlook report from the EIA was something that was going to be closely watched today. It did come out, and it was pretty dovish, to be quite honest with you. And this is a report that the Biden administration was looking at to really kind of give it a key on what it wants to do with the SPR. And so I'm going to throw up this screen right now, just kind of give you an idea of what's been going on with the whole SPR this week. And as you can see, the last everyone's been talking about the SPR, and there's only really been 3 releases in 1995, in 2005, and 2011. And I think that the closest analogy probably to what's going on right now is 2011, when there was a 30 million barrel increase by the U.S. and 60 million in total, and half of that was products and half of it was crude. And I think that the key point out of that was that it did not result in much price action. The first day it dropped around 4.5%, about $4. But within a week, it was back up above those levels, and a month later, it exceeded those levels. And so I think the indication here is that having short-term, crude SPR releases really doesn't work. It all feels good. It's great politically, but it really doesn't work. And so I think when we look at the short-term energy outlook today, like I said before, it came out, I think there was about 70% odds being dialed in that the U.S. prior to this report would release SPR this week or make an announcement of that. And I think that short-term energy report pretty much put those odds at pretty remote at this point in time. And so, that's what we say. And so, it's really been a good week for crude. I think it's going to continue to be a good week for crude going forward. And I think the other thing is the COP26 conference is going on. It's been going on for the last week. It will go through this week. And people were looking to see how some of these non-energy, these new energy transition stocks would do. And they went into the COP26 with high hopes. And in the last week, they've kind of gone sideways to slightly down. If you look at the ICLN, which is Clean Energy Index, it's down about 3 or 4% since the COP26 conference started out. And the XLE is up around 3 or 4%. And what's really, really amazing, and we'll go into what our guests are going to talk about, the uranium ETF, global ETF, is up about 15% since the conference has started. And a lot of that is because some of the news that we're hearing from some of the countries at COP26 talking about nuclear aspirations over the next 5 or 6 years. So I know we're limited on time, so we'll leave it there.
Okay, awesome. Matt Portillo, our head of research, what's on your mind?
Yeah, Maynard, just wanted to hit on a couple of key items. One, really excited about the conference. It's been a great event. And from the research standpoint, this is a key focus for us. We've scaled into about 20 new coverage names in the global renewable power complex, in RD, working towards RNG, hydrogen. And as we move forward, things like Bitcoin mining are also on our radar screen. So we're quite excited about it. One key point that I wanted to talk about was really the electrification of the auto fleet. Our team does cover the auto space, and it has been a big impact to the way that these stocks have traded and how investors are thinking about the space. Probably no more relevant, and something that's really key of mine here in the next few days is the IPO of Rivian, which Ford owns a large interest in and has been one of the key drivers of the equity moving forward. So we continue to see this shift in the way that auto OEMs are moving forward, and electrification trends are quite key. But for us, I think it's the tech angle. It's really going to be a big story over the next 10 years around big tech meeting big auto. And in our view, it's L2 autonomy and L4 autonomy. And we're seeing a proliferation of new systems hit the market. And I think it's going to be a very active 2022 world as we start to see some of these things move forward from commercialization. So just to give you a little bit of context in the players in the market and what we're seeing from traditional OEMs as well as new entrants, we have Google with Waymo, Amazon with Zoox, Intel with Mobileye on the tech front, really competing with GM with Cruise and Ford with Argo AI coming to market. And then obviously Tesla with their FSD system are really chasing a lot of disruptive technology that's going to change the way the consumer moves. And so for us, this is a big trend we think is going to continue to proliferate in the space. It's going to be quite disruptive to the way that automotive passenger vehicles actually transport themselves, and it's also going to be a big disruption to the delivery as a service market. So something just to keep an eye on. It continues to drive equity valuations higher, and we think it's going to be a very active market in 2022 and a key theme for investors to focus on over the next 12 months.
Hey, Matt, and this is not a request to have you comment really one way or the other, just a framework, but the number I saw on Rivian was like $70 billion or some number like that. Is there a way for those of us here to just kind of frame that up? Like, how do you think about that, dollar per blank or discounted value of blank, or is there a framework around that you know of?
It's really a sector that is valued on two different frameworks. So in the traditional OEM space, and this is why we are actually quite constructive on GM and Ford, we think they're going to go through a multi-year re-rate as we start to see these higher margin revenues flow through, particularly with L2 and L4 autonomy, but also as they catch up on electrification trends. Those stocks still tend to trade at 7 to 9 times earnings multiples on a forward basis because the market's concerned that they won't make the transition from ICE vehicles to EVs. In our view, they're going to actually be very competitive. And then you have a lot of the startups like Tesla, which is valued over $1 trillion, and its market cap, Rivian, as you mentioned, Lucid, and others that have come to market recently that have very rich valuations. And a lot of investors are basically valuing those companies on 2025 to 2030 estimates and using kind of DCF valuations. So similar to what we saw in shale in 2010, there's just a big bifurcation in the way the market's looking at new entrants in the shale market versus maybe the integrateds. And over time, we think those valuations will start to compress as the market sifts through what reality actually plays out over the next 12 months.
Okay. All right. Colin, how about you, sir?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. In honor of our guests, I just have a quick point to make about nuclear in California. Obviously, our theme is disruption, and we take that to mean technology. But as you probably know, we had a very severe drought in the West this year. And in particular, hydroelectric production in California was down 32% year to date through August. And when we look at what filled the gap, we get nuclear was up 17%. And importantly, all of that came from one plant, the Diablo Canyon plant, 2.25 gigawatts, about 8 to 9% of generation in California. And as our guests are going to talk about, there's, of course, a lifetime to assets. The 2 units at Diablo are only 40 years old, but they're slated to be decommissioned in 24 and 25. And so here we're setting up a situation where a technology, admittedly from the past, not so much from looking into the future, played a crucial role in giving us reliability for electricity generation, and yet is going to be pulled out of the system, perhaps with having some gas-fired and other capacity to take its place, but maybe not. And we'll see what happens. But I thought that'd be a useful segue into our guests, and I'll turn it back to you, Maynard.
Fantastic. Well, Craig, let me just ask you, as we jump to Everett and Matt, any big takeaway today?
Yeah, I think there's a few. When the demand for understanding and knowledge in this area is, it's off the charts at this point, right? And so, just when we look at our numbers of combined online and in the room here, but I think there's a few things that I observed throughout the day. One of them, is just about the mindset. This entire topic of energy and energy transition and carbon, and a lot of the things we hear about aren't actually brand new technologies, right? There are a share of those, but they're actually things like geothermal that have been around for a long time, right? Greenhouse gas reporting technologies have been around for a long time, but all of a sudden they're being seen in a new light, and you can just feel that step change. In the funding, there's so many early stage investments, but it's not just the traditional VC investor who's looking at them. And so you've got all kinds of pools of capital that are looking for ways to get involved. They're trying to figure out which technologies they're comfortable with. The noise or the talk we hear in the media, et cetera, around the various technologies isn't necessarily commensurate with how comfortable investors are with each different technology. I think the software and data side is going to be massively enabling, and for those of us who aren't traditionally software or data people, the layperson, it's really hard to grasp until you see it and hear the carbon panel, for example, just talking about things that I wouldn't have conceived of myself, but all of a sudden they're not just realities, but they're things that are growing very quickly. And then the last thing is, it's hard, right? When every discussion about batteries, you realize that battery chemistry is difficult. But as our keynote earlier this morning, that kicked us off this morning, highlighted, we're moving at this speed and scale of transition, which I think, in his words, are being underestimated. And so it is something that's happening at a pace that it's easy to get left behind.
Awesome. All right, well, Everett and Matt, welcome. There's a pack of folks here who are intrigued with your comments. Let me just hit again, a couple of the highlights of these guys' backgrounds. So Everett's a senior technical advisor in new reactor and advanced technology. He's been at the NEI for quite a long time now. He's got a PhD from MIT in nuclear engineering. And then Matt, also at the NEI for quite a long time. He was also a policy advisor in the Office of Nuclear Energy at the Department of Energy. And he's a Cornell man and a Tulane man. So these guys know their stuff. I think where we thought we'd start, guys, unless you have an introductory comment, is you've got an interesting presentation on nuclear, and we thought we might ask you to go through it. But I tell you, the first thing I was struck by when we reached out to you guys is you said something like, wow, 6 months ago the phone wasn't ringing, and now everybody wants to be our best friends. It was something like that. But do you guys mind just saying a little bit about yourselves before we jump into the materials? And any introductory comments you'd make?
Thank you, Maynard, for the introduction and for the invitation. It is always exciting when we get the chance to engage with people who really know the energy industry, who come around and say, wait a second, doesn't nuclear have a role here? And it's a chance to reintroduce ourselves to what this technology is about, how it can contribute, and how it fits with everything else that's undergoing change right now in the energy system. The technology development is a big part of it, but I think what Colin set up, and even the conversation from before, I think an appreciation that the energy system, what we need from our energy system is changing so quickly. We need to also think anew about how we provide it and what we're trying to accomplish here. And I think in that regard, we have had a lot of attention that we, for a while, kind of a little on the outside there. Even at the Conference of Parties the last 2 weeks, nuclear has had a much stronger voice there than I think in any of the previous sessions. So we're seeing it's not just in the US, but globally. Everett, you've been with a lot of folks who are doing some technology innovation. I imagine you must be feeling it too.
It's really impressive what's going on these days and the interest in nuclear. There's been a lot of activity, and we're going to talk about that in the presentation, so I won't get into it right now, but it's a really exciting time. One thing I'd mention relative to the last conversation on Bitcoin mining, there's actually been 3 agreements between Bitcoin miners and 2 agreements between Bitcoin miners and nuclear utilities to get that reliable power. And then another agreement between a Bitcoin miner and a new developer for future nuclear. So that was something that wasn't here 6 months ago. So its landscape is changing.
Awesome. Well, why don't we jump in? You guys have got a nice presentation, and then we might stop you just as we go on a page or two and ask you a question, but I'll invite you to pull that up and let's talk about it.
Happy to do so. Let me give you just a little bit about who we are at NEI. We're the trade association for the nuclear industry. We have members who fit in all parts of the system, from companies that own nuclear plants to those that build them and supply them. We have lawyers, academics, national labs. And our job is to act as the unifying voice for the industry, both in public communications and in interactions with the government and with federal regulators, and trying to bring together a consensus of what nuclear energy can mean in the US and abroad. Our vision that we're working towards is a world powered by clean and reliable energy. That's what we think we are can provide, but it's not just us. We recognize that there is a transition taking place, and nuclear is a role in providing that energy needs of the future that we talked about. Our mission that we're working towards is to promote the use and growth of nuclear energy through efficient operations and effective policy. So we're the promotional arm. We're trying to make sure that the conditions are in place for nuclear to be successful, both in the marketplace and also in how we operate our plants. So let me get to the fun part. Let's get to the plants themselves on the next slide. Right now, we have 93 nuclear units at 54 plants across the country. I'll get into kind of how nuclear fits in the broader perspective momentarily, but one thing to note is where we fit in the picture. A lot of our plants are deeply appreciated by the communities in which we operate. They are a strong source of well-paying long-term jobs, and then we have a great deal of enthusiasm and support in the communities in which we operate. These are well-paying jobs, often have a union representation as part of them, and that great support has been a foundational element of how we've continued to maintain the fleet that we have and work towards expanding in the future. Nuclear energy provides about 20% of the electricity in the US and has for a few decades now, honestly. Last year, we were the second largest source of power behind natural gas and just ahead of coal. I expect this year coal will move back ahead with the coal to gas switching and going the other way for a little bit. But if we go to the next slide, I think where we get to the more interesting part is how nuclear fits in this carbon-free discussion. We provide the majority of the carbon-free generation in the US, and if you go back for the last 30 or 40 years, it's actually been about 2/3 of the carbon-free electricity in the country has come from nuclear energy. Colin mentioned hydropower has been by far the second largest source over that time period. The wind is growing quickly.
Hey, Matt, could I just ask you while we're in this section, those 92 plants, could you give us a sense of like the average vintage or average age, or what would you tell us about, the lifespan of those?
Sure. I mean, right now, just about every one of those 93 units has received a license renewal from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So let me back up. When plants go into service, they receive an operating license for 40 years of operation. The plurality of our plants were built in the 1970s with some capacity completion in the 1980s, and some stragglers shortly after that. But for the most part, we've got a lot of plants that have received this license renewal to go to 60 years. One thing that's worth pointing out, though, is there's been a lot of capital turnover at these plants. My father was in the Air Force for many years, and we used to marvel at the B-52s they used to fly in Vietnam, how those same planes were still in operation in Desert Storm in the 1990s, in spite of the fact there wasn't a single component that was original on them. And the nuclear fleet has a lot of similarities to that as well.
So Matt, is that another way of saying that the heyday of public acceptance of nuclear energy was sort of, late 60s to mid 70s? Is that what's the sweet spot of its popularity?
So there was certainly a lot of public enthusiasm. I'd even put it a little prior to that point where you really saw the heyday of the science fiction aspect of it. In the 1970s, you did see a pretty significant expansion. I think it was driven by something that people in this room will appreciate, and it was the oil embargo. When energy became really a source of security, of economic and national security, finding sources that didn't rely upon fuel through abroad was a pretty big priority. Nuclear energy was seen as a significant way to address that challenge. And there was a large build out in the 1970s in particular. We had the 3 Mile Island event in the late 70s, which cooled quite a bit of the enthusiasm. But honestly, we were seeing challenges even before 3 Mile Island, and those showed up financial more than in the public opinion. These are capital intensive machines, and as interest rates were in the double digits, it's a very difficult time to try to have a large-scale capital investment, and there's some significant headwinds for the technology. And what we've seen now, and what Everett will get to, is a lot of where the technology has gone in the last 10 years has been in reaction to what we've learned over this period. The designs we're seeing now are smaller, more modular, faster to construct, in no small part as a realization that the economic pressures in which we're operating can look very different, and having a technology that's flexible is quite valuable in this context. Let me pick up on this slide for a second too, because I think this slide tells a story that's not too far off from the one we were just getting at. What makes nuclear energy power so valuable right now in the United States, one of the many things, is that they are very efficient machines. They run over 90% of the time. So for the last 2 decades, our nuclear fleet has been operating at 90% capacity factors year after year. But if I look back at it, that wasn't always what we saw. In 1990, the capacity factor of the fleet was closer to 60%. So let me sort of lay out what this all means. Between 1990 and 2010, 20 years, I added about 2% of capacity to my nuclear fleet. However, during that same period of time, I increased my generation by 40%. So we ended up producing a lot more nuclear power over the course of the period because we got much better at optimizing the efficiency of how we operate the plants. And this has been something that we have been persistent in how the plant has performed. And we've begun to see some of these lessons learned expand overseas as well to the operational profiles of abroad. Let's go to the next slide. Because we've also seen a different generation transition over this time period as well. Time scales aren't quite the same. I think this slide goes back to 2002. And that's the cost to operate the plants. So the total generating cost here covers fuel, covers capital investments, and operations, which is largely people. From about up to about 2012, we began to see a bulge of capital investment. These were plants that were making long-term decisions to operate beyond 40 years, so we're seeing major component replacements. And around that time, of course, people in this room will know, the market for wholesale electricity began to look very different. And so as that capital investment wave wound down, attention in the industry focused much more towards reducing the cost of generating electricity. From the point of 2012 till today, producing nuclear electricity is now more than 30% cheaper than it was in 2012. It's been a difficult market still. We've lost plants along the way to the economics. But right now, looking back to the entire time we've had this data from 2002, in constant dollars, this is the most cost-effective nuclear energy has been in the United States. We have seen a newfound appreciation for operational efficiency of these plants. Let's go to the next slide. Because as we've seen, we talked a little bit about the license extension story about going from 40 to 60 years, but that's not where we're stopping. We've already seen 6 units that have received license renewals to go from 60 to 80 years. 7 more are being reviewed right now, and there are more in the pipeline behind. What we're seeing is an appreciation that these plants are part of the long-term vision for the companies that own them, and in particular as we work towards a lower carbon system. Let's go to the next slide. This is from the International Energy Agency, and as they looked at what the most cost-effective forms of carbon-free generation would look like, the one they started with, the lowest cost one, is license extension of nuclear plants, which is a pretty straightforward observation. The most cost-effective way to keep carbon-free electricity is to keep what you got and then go add some more. And that message has gotten through. Let me go to the next slide. So what we're showing here are the trajectories of utilities that have made commitments to reduce carbon emissions over time. The ones in blue are our members, the ones in gray we're tracking as well. And what we see is an industry driving towards lower carbon emissions. And what we also are seeing is the appreciation of, well, how exactly are we going to get there? What is that portfolio of technologies going to look like that's going to make those commitments a reality on the grid? Let's go to the next one. This is the hard problem of how we begin to think about what that portfolio looks like. And we've seen some pretty helpful analyses over the last few years that have clarified how the components need to look together. So what I'm showing here is a study from the journal Joule that looked at what the portfolio technologies could be for decarbonization. So as I go from left to right, I am heading towards lower and lower emission rates in my electricity system. The red line on the left is taking 2 classes of technologies to do it. What they call fuel-saving technologies, or basically traditional variable renewables like wind and solar. Fast burst technologies as well to complement them, which are essentially energy storage, batteries, pumped hydro. Comparing that to on the right, where I add the third leg of the stool, which are firm, low-carbon generation technologies. Nuclear, fossil fuels with carbon capture, geothermal. And what you see is a dramatic difference of the cost profile, which is the y-axis there. So having this complementarity of, yes, I need renewables, yes, I need storage, but I also need something that can run 24/7, and especially take some of the seasonal variability and complement that technology. Let's take a different perspective of this. Let's go to the next one. Earlier this year, Princeton put together a very large analysis, what they call Net Zero America, of a handful of scenarios looking at what is really going to take to have a low carbon grid. Of all things, I think this might even have been on last week with John Oliver this week, which is a very bizarre thing to say in a presentation here, but I think that actually happened. The engineering firm Worley took a look at those analyses and just compared 2 of them. One was in blue, what happened if you maybe can't have the most massive expansion of renewables you can imagine, versus the one in red, which is, well, what if I'm going to do it all with renewables? And what I want to point to are the bars towards the bottom. Because on those bars, what you begin to see is, okay, well, what is the build rate I'm looking for both things like offshore wind and solar? And you're talking in the cases about a 4 or 5x multiple of deployment rates for those technologies than the 100% renewable case versus the one I still have a lot of renewables, but it's not solely aligned to the technologies. But the kicker that gets me is the one at the bottom, which is how I think about long-distance transmission. I work in the nuclear business. Siting long-distance transmission is really hard. Right? It's time-consuming, it is difficult, the regulatory process is hard, working across state lines is almost impossible. And what you need in order to make a grid reliant upon renewables to really work is a massive transmission system. By way of comparison, if I think about this, in the Obama administration, the Department of Energy identified about 3,000 or so miles worth of high priority transmission that needed to be built out. We're about a decade on from that, and about 15% of that has been built, which kind of tells you it is a difficult challenge to work through just trying to use the renewables and the transmission. Nuclear has a way to make all of that easier. It's all hard, but by having these nuclear technologies, I take what is an almost impossible problem and I make it merely daunting.
Hey, Matt, maybe we could ask you while we're here, because somebody asked me earlier today, is there anything in this infrastructure bill or all this current spending around nuclear? Any new boost to investment?
In the infrastructure bill, I'll point to three things. First of all, there is a program being stood up at the Department of Energy that will identify nuclear plants that are at risk of closing and provide up to $6 billion for the injection of cash to make sure that doesn't happen. So for someone like me who actually left DOE to come to NEI precisely because this problem of closing plants seemed one that was really hard to work from the Department of Energy, to actually have a national policy that says, no, we're going to make sure these plants don't close, and we put billions of dollars behind it, is a real change. That doesn't stop there. Everett's going to talk a bit about some of the efforts to develop and demonstrate new reactor technologies. One of the remarkable things about the infrastructure bill is it actually pre-funds the government's commitment to share the cost of deploying that. So normally you enter these cost-sharing arrangements and you kind of hope Congress ponies up the money later. This actually says, nope, you put it aside, you're good to go. Last thing I'll point out too in the infrastructure bill, there's an increased interest in how to use hydrogen, both for reducing emissions in the power sector, but I think for me, it really stands out in the industrial sector. There's provisions to begin to build hydrogen hubs, one of which in the infrastructure bill is required to be produced by nuclear hydrogen, using nuclear to produce the hydrogen. So yeah, there's that, and there's even more in the reconciliation bill, but I'll put that aside.
And Matt, for our all of us are students of nuclear, the hydrogen you make with nuclear for your color chart, this is pink hydrogen, correct?
You might imagine I've never been all that enthusiastic about the color coding. It is carbon-free hydrogen. That's the most important thing. I've heard pink. I've heard others. I don't understand how that helps me explain the fact that now if you're trying to reduce carbon emissions, something that is not using carbon to produce a hydrogen is the way to go, and that's what counts.
Well, Matt, I'm sorry. There's just some international body somewhere that's choosing these colors. I'm teasing you, but no, that's good.
I think it actually is, as I looked this one up, I think it's actually my friend Julio Friedman, now at Columbia, formerly DOE. I think he said it kind of off the top and said as a joke, and it took off. No one realized he was joking. Let me go back to the slide because I want to pivot to Everett. So I've emphasized how important it is that we have these assets that are these large sources of carbon-free power on the system already. We're going to build on those to start. But if I look at what we're heading towards to create these carbon-free systems, I need more. Let's go to the next slide. What we're seeing with our members are utilities are beginning to look around saying, well, as they look at their grid, the portfolio they're trying to build, they see a role for new nuclear. It's not necessarily nuclear they have now. The technology might feel different. But whether you're talking about zero emitting load following resources, or Dominion, or Excel saying they can get to 80%, but then they get stuck. We have renewed attention on nuclear, and when I think about the phone beginning to ring again, I think this is what's been driving a lot of it, that as these companies are making commitments to reduce their carbon emissions in the future, they're looking for the suite of technologies, and nuclear is right on that list of saying, well, okay, let's see what that can do for us. And with that, let me turn to Everett, because the important lesson here and the really exciting part is what it can do looks an awful lot more interesting than what it could have, how you answered that question 10 years ago. So Everett.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. So if we could go to the next slide. So the way I like to think about this is a continuum of innovation. And I'm going to take a little bit of time and talk about some of that. But starting here, we are actually building 2 large light water reactors right now down in Georgia, 1,100 megawatt electric AP1000s. First one will come online next year, Vogtle 3, and then Vogtle 4 will come online the following year. But then as we look out in the 2020s, we're looking at some new deployments in the mid part of the 2020s with some microreactors, and then larger reactors in the latter half of the 2020s, and I'll talk about that. But then as we look forward, we begin to think about a rapid development and a large number of deployments coming in the early 2030s. So, next slide. Now, in terms of what we're going to have to offer here, well, it's going to be quite a variety. So we've got advanced reactors, and when I say advanced reactors, what I really mean is something that's not operational right now. We've got a range of sizes coming from microreactors, which we typically think of as less than 20 megawatt electric, but could be as small as 1 megawatt electric. Compared that to the 1,000 megawatt electric I talked about that's being built down in Georgia. And then we have small modular reactors. Those by definition are less than 300 megawatt electric. And we have a number of companies developing those, both water-cooled designs, like what we currently operate in the U.S., and then non-water-cooled designs. So what I mean by that is the coolant for the fuel is something like high-temperature helium or liquid metal, like liquid sodium or liquid lead, or it could even be molten salt. And actually, in the case of molten salt, we may use molten salt as the fuel, so both liquid fuel and salt for the coolant. So kind of an interesting design. And we're going to have a range of sizes coming here, and I'm going to take a little few minutes and talk about a few of these. But let's move on to the next slide. So in terms of companies that are developing them, so this is a list of companies that are members of NEI. As Matt said, we're a trade association, so we represent the commercial industry. We're a member organization. So these are all companies developing new advanced technologies. All of them are developing reactors with the exception of one who's developing a commercial radiothermal generator. And many of these companies I'm sure you've heard of, Westinghouse, GE, Framatome. Others you may not have heard of. Terrapower you've probably heard of, many of you, if not all of you, through the news. That's one that's partially funded by Bill Gates. But the majority of these companies are private funded companies. So really exciting work going on here. And this is not the entire landscape, because I can name about 5 others or so that are either focused outside the U.S. or are outside of the U.S. To begin with, that are not members of NEI. So, but a huge number of companies involved here.
So, Everett, could I just ask you sort of a slightly unfair question, but there's a lot of investors here in our audience, and they're thinking about funding new technologies. Is it your perception that a financial firm can get into this space and invest a reasonable amount of money with reasonable risk? Or because I think the picture sometimes people get is that nuclear is dollars and billions and cost overruns, and you better be careful. But your page seems to suggest it's a place for new entrants to invest money.
Oh, I think it absolutely is, and some of these companies are taking that sort of investment, so it absolutely is. The one thing about nuclear, in terms of fission power anyways, we know for sure the technology is going to work. The questions are, licensing and development and time period and all of that. But we know the technology is going to work. But as I'm going to talk about, what we're doing here with advanced nuclear is things are a bit different than what we've done in the past. makes it more appealing, both in terms of cost and deployment schedule, as well as the potential to do things beyond just electricity. So I personally think they're really great investment opportunities. Now, if we hit the next slide, let me touch on a few of those aspects here. So when we think about advanced nuclear, we think about simpler, and our industry is trying to learn from the past. So the 93 reactors that Matt said we have currently operating are all basically different. We never really standardized designs. We're looking to try to do that a bit more. So like the two Vogtle plants, 3 and 4 that are being built are identical. But as we move forward here with the different companies, we're trying to learn lessons from the past as well. So smaller means simpler, less parts, less equipment. Also trying to make these reactors be able to move that construction, more of it back into a factory setting. So the smaller the machine, the more able you are to build stuff in a factory, which minimizes construction time. And then also trying to do things like use readily available equipment in terms of turbines and stuff like that. So as much off the shelf as you can. And then because of some of the designs, so like the liquid metal and liquid molten salt reactors, they operate at close to atmospheric pressure. So you don't need high pressure systems like we currently have with the light water reactors. So more inherently safe, and all of that is going to result in more cost competitive. So hit the next slide, please. So I'm going to take a few minutes now and talk about some of the particular designs. And the ones I'm focusing on, just to be clear, I'm focusing on those that have projects lined up that are planning to build, build in the not too distant future. So NuScale, they are by far the furthest along in terms of advanced reactor companies. They actually got a design certification from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission last year in 2020. So they're a novel design in the sense that they're going to have each reactor is a small modular reactor. So each reactor is 77 megawatt electric. And they plan to either deploy them in like a 4-pack, 6-pack, or 12-pack. So you, as the customer, got your choice, 4, 6, or 12 reactors in a single facility. That provides them the ability to rapidly adjust power, total power up and down by adjusting individual modules. And something that's different now, air cooling for condensers. So condensing that steam back to water using air cooling. That's nice because think out west for a second, and we're just talking about Texas, but think out west where you have major water challenges. This would minimize water usage. So an interesting idea there. Next slide. And here we have a customer, Utah Associated Municipal Power System, so a collection of municipal utilities. They are planning to build, construct, and operate the NuScale reactor at Idaho National Laboratory, bringing that first module of a 6-pack online in 2029. UAMPS, I should mention, does not currently have any nuclear assets. This is the carbon-free power project that they're doing, so focused on that carbon-free aspect here. They have a $1.4 billion multi-year cost share from the Department of Energy. Next slide. Now, switching gears and going way down in size, Oklo, Aurora Fission battery. So they're a microreactor, 1.5 megawatt electric, about 10 years or more before refueling. So put the fuel in, sit there for 10 years or so, then you need to refuel. That's different right now. We refuel every 18 to 24 months for the fleet. They are the first non-water-cooled reactor to have an application in front of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it was submitted in March of last year, accepted for review, and is under review right now. They plan to demonstrate also at Idaho National Laboratory around 26. So you may be wondering what the market for this is. Think remote locations, think Alaska, where you may have to bring in diesel fuel, for example, once or twice a year, depending on the weather. So great opportunity here, and I'll tell you something, the mining industry in Canada, for example, is very much interested in this because one of the big challenges in mining is getting access to power. Next slide. The Department of Defense is also interested in mobile microreactors, and here they plan to do a demonstration also at INL around 24. So the concept here is a reactor that can be flown in by plane, set up in 3 days, operated for as long as you want to, shut it off, 7 days later, ship it out, move it somewhere else if you need to, start it up again. So very innovative concept supported by the Department of Defense. Next slide. And then the Department of Energy, and Matt touched on this a bit in terms of the infrastructure bill. The Department of Energy implemented what's called an advanced reactor demonstration program. They did it last year with funding coming out of Congress in FY20. Basically, there's three aspects to this. They're creating a pipeline of technology. The first one is focused on demonstrating 2 reactors that can be operational in about 7 years. That's Terrapower and X-Energy. And that's a total of $3.2 billion that's been put into that from the government. And the infrastructure bill prepaid $2.5 billion of that. Next slide. And then there's another aspect of this, which is risk reduction for future demonstrations. And here you're looking at a commercial horizon about 5 years later than the demo. DOE awarded 5 companies there. Southern Company, by the way, that is the utility down south. So a utility is here with an award working on developing an advanced reactor. So very interesting there. And then Advanced Reactor Concepts 20, a little further out in the time horizon in the 2030s. So next slide. I'm going to touch on the 2 main demonstration reactors here. First is Terrapower with the Natrium reactor. So it's a liquid sodium fast reactor, 345 megawatt electric. They're attaching to it from the get-go a molten salt thermal storage system. So easiest way I kind of think about this is if you're operating next to a solar plant during the daytime when the sun is strong and your solar's putting out a lot of power, this reactor will put less than 345 on the grid and heat up sodium, heat up the salt. Then at night when the sun shuts down, goes down, and the solar stops producing, they can pull energy out of that molten salt thermal storage system and they can peak out at about 500 megawatt electric onto the grid. They're going to deploy in Wyoming. Wyoming currently has no nuclear. They do mining for uranium, but no nuclear. And they're planning to deploy around 2027, 2028, and cost share with DOE. Next slide. And here, X-Energy, so completely different concept. X-Energy is a pebble bed helium-cooled gas reactor, 80 megawatt electric, build them in a 4-pack, 320 megawatts total. They're going to deploy in Washington State around the same time period, 27, 28. Here they're using TRISO fuel, so it's particles of uranium coated in graphite and carbon, and then thousands of those particles put together into a pebble. That pebble, by the way, is about the size of a billiard ball. So the way this reactor works, think about a gumball machine. You put the pebbles in the top, they come out the bottom, you check it, see if it's been in the reactor long enough. If so, you discharge it. If not, put it back in the top, and then add new ones as you go along. So innovative concept, exceptionally robust fuel that was developed at Idaho National Laboratory. Next slide. So this is a summary of the projects in the U.S. here, so between now and 2030. So Vogtle 3 and 4, the Oklo, Aurora, UAMPS, DOD, Terrapower, X-Energy I've talked about. The last 2, Kairos and Southern Company, these are test reactors, so they're not going to generate electricity, they're not going to put power on the grid. The Terrapower and X-Energy we call them demonstrations, but they're truly commercial reactors that are going to be operated by utilities, put power on the grid for revenue purposes. Kairos and Southern Company are doing small machines to de-risk future deployments. So very interesting. Next slide. And thinking about future applications, so it's something your audience may be interested in. These reactors operate at higher temperatures, the liquid metal and the molten salt reactors, so that affords that opportunity with 500 to 700 degrees C outlet temperature to do things beyond just electricity. So you could do hydrogen production much easier, much more efficiently, and use process heat. Next slide. And hydrogen. So right now we are looking at hydrogen usage and generation. So we have 4 projects underway with the current fleet. Exelon, Energy Harbor, Xcel, and Arizona Public Service have all received DOE awards to do hydrogen generation. One of them will be bringing online hydrogen generation in 23. They're going to use either electricity or, in the case of one of the utilities, use high-temperature heat, steam from the reactor to generate hydrogen. The hydrogen can be used for transportation purposes, industrial purposes, and in one case it's going to be used as an energy storage medium, so fed back into combined cycle natural gas, so mixing it with natural gas to reduce carbon emissions there. So the industry thinks very much that hydrogen is a big part of the future here in terms of decarbonizing the sector. Next slide. And so kind of wrapping up here, key takeaways. So as Matt's talked about, consumers and policymakers are increasingly demanding low carbon electricity, and we're seeing huge support from Congress, both in the infrastructure bill, the reconciliation bill, plus previous legislation and increase in appropriations. And then you're seeing support at the state level for preserving the fleet, and very much interest from states in building new reactors. And then, of course, maintaining existing nuclear, least expensive way to avoid low carbon emissions. And so with that, we think wind, solar, nuclear storage, all needs to work together. You've seen that actually in some of the designs here, as I talked about, Terrapower, for example, combining storage from the beginning. So very interesting time. So let me stop there. Actually, just hit the next slide for 1 second. So that's a question slide, and what that image is showing a conceptual idea of putting reactors, say, at a server farm, for example. So microreactors powering a server farm. So new concepts, new ideas for technology.
Well, and guys, you're kind enough to put, these aren't just any emails, these are Everett's and Matt's emails directly, so you can reach these guys. Guys, look, it's a fantastic presentation. It really gets you thinking. Maybe we could ask you, part of what we've been doing today is just trying to think way outside the box and just kind of bracket stuff and imagine a world that's very different. The stats you had said nuclear, 20% of U.S. power today. When you guys are alone and dreaming, in 20 years, how big could that number be? Like, what's the top of the mountain if we really got after this, really invested, developed these new technologies? How do you guys think about the upside case for nuclear in terms of percent of U.S. electricity?
Well, that's an interesting case. What I'll point out is, at the height of building nuclear power in the mid-'70s, we were adding on the order of, I think there's 12 gigawatts a year for about 3 years. So once we begin to stand up what the supply chain could look like and build those muscles back, you can go fairly quickly. I think what's interesting about the question is, if I'm thinking about that case where I'm looking to deploy this much nuclear, where I'm saying looking at 30% by 2040 or 35%, 40%, I'm also thinking about a grid that's going to look very different of what it's being asked to do and how it's fitting in the economy as a whole. That's a scenario where I see a lot of electricity use in industrial applications and transportation. I'm using a lot of power. So even if I do imagine a scenario where I'm doubling my nuclear fleet, I'm tripling my nuclear fleet, I also think I'm adding a lot more of everything else too. And so I think less in terms of market share and more in terms of the scale opportunity here.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think when I think what the future is going to bring, I think nuclear doing things beyond just electricity. So nuclear being process heat, say, for refineries. Nuclear being at mining locations where it's currently not. So seeing nuclear pop up, reactors pop up in places you wouldn't normally think of.
You guys mentioned, this is not just happening in the U.S. This is, it's happening at COP26. A number of countries around the world are rethinking this. We've seen news out of the UK, I think, in particular, about nuclear. But where would you guys tell us are the super budding pro-nuclear spots around the world? And, maybe where are the few places where, you're least enthusiastic about it making a comeback?
Well, I think there's two obvious places to start. One is China. They have a significant program to expand nuclear power already on the books. And it's one of they didn't have a strong presence at COMP, but one of the places they did double down was the extent to which they plan to use nuclear. What I also think is interesting, though, is what we're seeing in Eastern Europe right now. So you have a lot of countries that are, on the one hand, being pressured to reduce carbon emissions, on the other hand, not really in a position where they can rely on renewables in the way some of their neighbors might want them to. They're looking to nuclear. Poland in particular is one that's very coal heavy, that's got a lot of interest in nuclear. I'll also point out that one of the announcements at COP was to a sharing arrangement to build that NuScale plant that Everett told you about in Romania. And what is interesting is it's not just they want nuclear, they want the new version of nuclear. They want it where it can become. And I think you're seeing that popping up in all kinds of parts of the world. You're seeing it in the Arab world, where the UAE just brought on another reactor. You're going to see it in Africa as well. The only places that I'm seeing nuclear being not having a role is in places where people have made an active decision to react to the political pressures of the past. So Germany, Austria, the ones that come to mind immediately. And I think those voices are being increasingly, those aren't the ones leading the conversation at this point. And that's what I think is really telling on the global level.
I'd add that north of the border, Canada, they're looking at new projects. In fact, you'll see an announcement coming out probably in the not too distant future, another month or so, about a small modular reactor that Ontario Power Generation is going to be choosing. So, going to be interesting.
On the geographical question, it's interesting to see how much of this is happening in Wyoming and Idaho. That was something that really jumped out at me, and I immediately think of the Powder River Basin and coal. So, one can imagine 100 years in the future, and people, say, what's the Powder River Basin, and was this ever coal country? It's nuclear country. I guess, Everett, I have a quick question on the pace of these experimental new nuclear technologies. If they really were proven to be something that had traction, how fast could that switch get flipped to be something much more commercial, so that we're suddenly seeing, maybe a clustering effect in 2029, or is that too soon? And then the second question, one of the themes of today has been loon shots. And in our prep meeting last week, we talked a little bit about fusion. And if you could just give the audience, how crazy is fusion? And if it did actually happen, what might that look like in terms of being another mountain?
Sure. So I think, you're looking at Terrapower and X Energy, two of the ones that are going to be deploying in 27, 28. Once they get going, I think it's going to be pretty rapid deployment thereafter. Some of the other technologies, like the molten salt, is going to come right behind it, but you see the companies de-risking that work with a small machine. So they're setting themselves up to prove it, relatively small investment, hundreds of millions of dollars, but investing, make sure it's going to work, and then do the next one. So I think nuclear can deploy very, very quickly. Fusion's fascinating. I mean, what you're seeing right now is a huge investment, private investment. In fact, there was just an announcement today about one company getting 300 and some million, I think, in investment. The interesting thing about fusion, one contrast I'd make with fission is we don't yet know if fusion will work. But the thing that has happened over the last couple decades is technology. So lasers, magnets, high temperature superconducting magnets, which is an interesting terminology, but that's enabled a new company, for example, Commonwealth Fusion, right out of MIT, my alma mater. So they're taking new technology, which is going to enable them to do a demonstration. What we still don't know is if it's going to work. If it does, then comes the challenge of, okay, now how do I ramp up and how do I deploy it and how do I turn it into an abundant electricity supply? So we shall see. We'll see how it goes, but it's really fascinating. And what's great about that is that you're seeing a huge number of private companies doing it. So I showed you the picture of the private companies in NEI doing fission. There's a similar, set of companies doing things in the fusion area.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this, that, all this is powered by uranium, and I'm thinking if this really catches on over the next 10, 15 years, do we have the capacity from a uranium standpoint to supply these, and where is that uranium concentrated?
So we do have the capacity to do it. Actually, the uranium market right now is a little bit on the. I mean, you're seeing a lot of spot prices go up quite dramatically, but there's still a lot of mining capabilities out there to expand. So some of the dominant players are Canada, Kazakhstan, Australia, and some others. We do mining in the U.S., in Wyoming, and a couple other locations, but we're not one of the dominant players, not yet anyways. But there's a lot of mining, a lot of uranium reserves out there that can be tapped into.
So guys, maybe as we wrap up, today's been all about technology. We're all about technology and good solutions, but there is an overhang of politics, you might say, in today's climate world. How does nuclear seems, non-aligned. Like it seems like you guys have done a good job of, it's not associated with a particular party or a particular point of view. How does nuclear navigate that? How do you, keep it, dare I say, a centrist source of energy? Because that's what it sort of seems to be.
Well, I think that you're right, and part of where it comes from to me is that from how the industry looks at it, we work best over long time horizons. So aligning ourselves on congressional calendars doesn't exactly fit what we're trying to do, which is create the conditions for long-term stable investments and predictable pathways. I think we've seen a lot more bipartisan support as climate has become the dominant issue on the environmental side. We've always enjoyed a fair amount of support from conservatives who value the long-term capital investment. But I think in general, it's making sure that we as advocates who understand technology can ensure that people understand what nuclear can mean for their priorities, what they're trying to accomplish. And we've seen more receptivity to that in recent months and years as the conversation has evolved. And I think this is not just for those of us in the industry, it's those around it, those who've been educated, those who know energy. And it's been an opportunity for us to be looked at in a new light, and I think this will be part of an evolution yet to come.
Well, look, from all of us here at the conference and from TPH, we just appreciate you guys hanging in there, keeping up the good fight, being there for us when we're circling back to you saying, hey, you got a pretty cool technology. Maybe we need you more than we realize. So thank you for all your commitment to the industry and to technology and good choices. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.